I still remember the cold in March of 1983 because it wasn't just in the air, it was inside people. The kind of cold that settles into your chest and doesn't leave. The kind you feel when you know something is ending and there's nothing left to argue about, nothing left to prove. Only numbers written down by men in coats who don't know the land but now own the paper. It's written on. And I was standing there in that wind, hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets, listening to an auctioneer warm up his voice, watching a crowd gather on ground that had once belonged to one man, one family, one idea of the future, and now was about to belong to whoever still had cash and nerve left. And in my inside pocket, folded once and then again, was a certified check I'd been carrying since dawn, heavy as iron, quiet as a promise, the kind of thing you don't talk about out loud. And across the yard, near the house, I could see Roger Sterling standing with his wife and 2 kids, his shoulders set stiff like he was bracing against more than just the wind, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not looking at the machines lined up in front of him, not looking at the people who'd come from 3 counties over, bankers in suits, investors with clean boots, farmers like me with our hands buried in our coats, all of us pretending this was just another sale. And I remember thinking, standing there before the first bid was even called, that if you'd told either of us back in 1976 that it would end this way, neither one of us would have believed you, not him in his brand new truck, not me in my grease-stained jacket, and certainly not the men at the coffee shop who thought they knew how the future worked. And as the auctioneer called for attention, and the crowd leaned in, I felt that old familiar weight settle into my gut. The same one I'd felt years earlier standing at the back of another auction, a smaller one, a quieter one when none of this had happened yet and everything still seemed possible. And just before the bidding started, just before I raised my hand, my mind went back, not by choice but by habit, back to the summer of 1976, Johnson County, Iowa, when all this really began, when people first started calling me cheap. And Roger Sterling started calling himself smart. That summer was thick with heat and confidence. The kind of summer where everyone talked big because the crops were tall and the prices were good. And the radio was full of promises about feeding the world and flags with red, white, and blue hung from porches because it was the bicentennial and it felt like the country itself was telling us things were only going one direction. And that direction was up. And the Miller Farm auction was supposed to be just another local sale. Old iron being cleared out after old man Miller passed. His boys long gone to Des Moines offices where their hands never got dirty. And I went there for one reason and one reason only. A John Deere 7000 4-row planter that wasn't new, but wasn't pretending to be either. The kind of machine that still made sense if you knew how to listen to it. And I stood off to the side, arms crossed, doing what you always do at an auction. When you don't want to pay more than you should, trying to look like you don't care, like you could walk away if you had to, even though you've already measured in your head exactly how it'll fit in your shed, and what it'll do for your ground. And I remember looking down at my hands that day, clean for once, but still marked permanent with grease in the lines, and under the nails, the kind of marks you don't wash off because they come from years, not days. And out in the pasture my old John Deere 4020 was idling, hooked to the disc, because there's always work waiting whether you win a bid or not. And that was when I heard him before I saw him. The sound of a big new diesel pulling into close to the sale ring. Not into the muddy parking area like everyone else, but right up where people would notice. And when I turned I saw Roger Sterling climbing out of his Ford F-50, candy apple red, still wearing the dealer sticker, clean enough you could have eaten off the hood. And he didn't have a trailer because he hadn't come to buy. He'd come to be seen, and Roger always liked being seen. Like the way heads turned when he showed up, like the way people measured themselves against him whether they meant to or not. And he walked over smiling like he already knew the punchline to a joke. The rest of us hadn't heard yet, wearing new Wranglers without a stain on them, a crisp shirt buttoned neat, hands that looked like they belonged to a salesman more than a farmer. And he was my age, 32, but he carried himself like he was already ahead, already winning, already right, and he looked at the line of old machinery and then at me and laughed, loud enough for a few heads to turn, and said, "Well, if it isn't Silas Blackwood, picking through the boneyard again. And I nodded because I didn't see any reason to give him more than that, and he kept going, asking if I was looking for parts for that museum piece I called a tractor, or if I was actually thinking of buying something. And when I told him I might bid on the planter, he laughed again and shook his head like I'd just told him a bad joke. Said, for God's sake, it's 1976. They've got air planters now that'll put a seed in the ground within a quarter inch every time. Cover 160 acres before lunch. And I told him this one would be paid for in cash and didn't. Have an air compressor waiting to quit. And he looked at me the way people do when they think you're missing the point entirely. Leaned in closer and lowered his voice like he was doing me a favor. Told me the boys at the coffee shop were calling me cheap. Said I was sitting on 140 acres free and clear, and didn't even know what to do with it. Said land was leverage now, collateral, that the bank was handing out money, that land was going up 10% a year, and I could be farming 500 acres by spring if I wanted to. And all I could think standing there listening to him was that his confidence didn't come from dirt or weather or work. It came from a loan officer's handshake. And when I told him I'd rather be called cheap and own what I ran than be called smart and be owned by the bank, his smile flickered for just a second before coming back wider, sharper, and he clapped me on the shoulder and told me not to come crying when that old iron left me stranded, because some of us had a future to build. And then he walked off shaking hands like he'd already bought the county, and the bidding started. And I waited, the way you do, letting the older guys go back and forth. And when it stalled, I raised my hand and paid $800 cash for that planter. More than I wanted, but less than it was worth. And as I walked over to pay, Roger's words stayed with me in a way I didn't like, because part of me wondered if he was right, if the world really had changed, and I was the only one standing still. And for the next few years, that question never really left, even when the planter worked the way I knew it would. Even when every bushel I brought in belonged to me and me alone, because everywhere I looked the signs pointed in his direction. Bigger machines, more land, more debt dressed up as progress. And people stopped calling him lucky and started calling him a genius. And they started calling me something else entirely, Sideline Silas. The man who could have been more if he wasn't so afraid. And standing there in 1983 with that check in my pocket and the wind cutting through my coat, watching the auctioneer clear his throat and call for the first bid, I realized that everything that was about to happen had been set in motion back then, not by a single decision, but by a way of thinking, by what each of us believed was worth holding onto when nobody was watching. And as the crowd leaned forward and the first number was called out, I felt my hand tighten inside my pocket around that folded piece of paper, and I knew that before the day it was over, before the hammer fell for the last time, one of us would finally have his answer. The spring of 1978 didn't announce itself with birdsong or sunshine, the way folks in town like to imagine. It came the way it always does in Johnson County, Iowa, with soft roads that swallow a boot, with a north wind that keeps its teeth even after the calendar says winter is done, and with that plain truth waiting at the edge of every field. If you don't get it in on time, you pay for it all year. By then, the John Deere 7000 planter I'd bought at the Miller auction had 2 seasons behind it, and it had done exactly what I knew it would do. It planted straight, it planted honest, and every time it rattled or squeaked, I knew where the sound was coming from, because I'd had it apart down to the last chain link in my little shop, with the dirt floor and the single bare bulb, and I'd replaced the disc openers, checked every bearing, and set those seed plates so careful you'd think I was building a watch instead of planting corn. It was slow work, for rows at a time, and I won't pretend I didn't feel the pressure when I'd see Roger Sterling fly by on the highway, with some new piece of machinery behind him like he was racing. The sun itself, but the difference between him and me wasn't speed, it was sleep. I slept at night because I didn't owe anybody a dime, and in the morning I woke up to my own place, my own title, my own problems. And there's a kind of peace in that people don't understand until it's gone. Still, peace doesn't keep the weeds out and it doesn't drop the seed. So I worked. I planted my corn. I worked my beans. I hauled loads to the elevator. I patched fences. I fixed what broke. And I did it the same way my father did and his father before him. Not because I thought the world hadn't changed, but because I knew the part of the world that mattered hadn't. Weather still didn't care about your plans, and machinery still didn't care about your pride, and the dirt under your nails was still the only thing that proved you'd been there. The coffee shop talk never stopped. Of course, it never does. Men with time on their hands always need someone to measure against, and I was an easy target. The guy with the old for 1020 and the paid for acres, the one who didn't grow, the one who wouldn't leverage. And every so often I'd hear my name mentioned like it was a warning label. Silas is too scared. Silas is too cheap. Silas is still farming like it's 1955. And sometimes I'd feel that little sting, not because I thought they were right, but because I knew how quickly a man can be made to doubt himself. When everyone else is moving in the same direction and you're not. Roger made sure I heard it too. He didn't even have to try. He was everywhere. He'd show up at the co-op with clean boots and a grin, talking about land values and interest rates like he was reading scripture, talking about how the bank was practically begging him to take money, how land was going up 10% a year, how you'd be a fool not to use it. And then he'd look over at me like he was doing me a kindness by letting me witness the future. He'd bought the old Miller place not long after that auction, and then another parcel and another. And by the time 1978 rolled around, he was farming close to 1,500 acres. Most of it rented, most of it financed, but he wore it like a crown. He'd traded up to bigger tractors, bigger tillage, bigger everything, International 1466, then bigger yet, and he talked about horsepower the way some men talk about religion. Like if you just believed hard enough and signed the papers, the land itself would reward you. I didn't argue with him anymore. I'd learned that arguing with a man who's never been punished for his choices is like arguing with a storm cloud that hasn't decided whether it wants to rain. You just watch and wait. And then, in the spring of 1978, the punishment came. For me first, not because I'd done something wrong, but because old iron has its own calendar and it doesn't care what you've got planted or what the forecast says. It was one of those days you can still feel years later. The ground finally fit. Just the right moisture, crumbling behind the disc the way it's supposed to. And I was in the back 80 trying to get my last field work before a rain. The weatherman kept promising, and my 4020 was pulling hard. A 6-bottom plow turning that black Iowa soil over like it was rolling out a quilt. And for a minute, just a minute, I felt that kind of quiet satisfaction you only get when things are going right, when the engine is steady, and the furrows are clean and you can see the work behind you, real work, the kind that stays. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud at first. It was sharp, a metallic crack like a rifle shot muffled by a blanket. And before my mind could even name it, the tractor shuddered. The power fell away like somebody cut a rope, and I heard a series of deep ugly clunks from inside the block. Not a rattle, not a knock you can nurse home, but a sound that says something has come loose where it can't come loose. The 4020 rolled to a stop and a plume of thick white smoke poured out of the stack, sour and final. And my heart dropped so hard it felt like it hit the ground before my boots did. I killed the ignition, jumped down, and there it was underneath, oil spreading dark and fast into the fresh-turned earth. And when I crouched and looked up along the side of the engine, my breath caught, because I saw the jagged hole punched clean through cast iron, fist-sized, raw metal shining at the edges. A connecting rod had come apart and punched its way out like it was trying to escape. And I knew in that instant there was no quick fix, no tightening a bolt, no praying at home. The block was ruined. The crank was ruined. The piston was ruined. The heart of my operation was dead in the middle of planting season. I stood up slowly and looked across my field, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it got, how even the wind felt like it stepped back. And then, out on the far road, I saw a cloud of dust, and I knew without even squinting it was Roger, running one of his big new Internationals, cabbed, air-conditioned, pulling more plow than I could dream of, moving twice as fast like he was trying to outrun the year itself. And I hated him in that moment, not because he'd done anything to me right then, but because his world looked smooth and mine looked broken, and the words he'd said 2 years earlier came back clear as if he'd whispered them into my ear. Don't come crying to me when that old iron leaves you stranded. Despair is a heavy thing. It doesn't scream. It just sits on your shoulders and makes everything feel farther away. Makes the barn look like a mile. Makes the phone in the kitchen feel like it's on another continent. I could have called the dealer. I could have had them tow the tractor in. And I could have signed papers for a new machine on a 5-year note and told myself it was just what you do now, what a smart man does, and I'll admit the thought came, quick and tempting, like a cold beer on a hot day, because it would have solved the immediate problem and nobody at the coffee shop would call me cheap anymore. They'd call me serious. They'd nod and say I'd finally joined the modern age. But then I pictured that note sitting on my kitchen table, my name under a number I didn't fully control, and I felt something like shame. Not the kind that comes from other people, but the kind that comes from betraying your own rules. My grandfather hadn't borrowed his way through the Depression. My father hadn't borrowed his way through the lean years. They fixed what broke. They made do. They learned to live inside their means because they'd seen what happens when you don't. So I climbed back up on the dead tractor, not to drive it, just to sit there a moment and breathe. And then I climbed down, shut the gate behind me, and started walking the 2 miles home on that gravel road, dust sticking to my sweat, thinking about 80 acres still waiting and a storm that didn't care about my plans. When I got to the house, I didn't sit down. I didn't even wash up. I went straight to the phone and called old man Hemmings first, because Hemmings was the kind of neighbor who still understood what it meant when another man said he was in trouble. He farmed with older equipment and a stubborn streak, and when I asked if I could borrow his Farmel M and his 4-bottom plow just to finish that field before the rain, he didn't ask why I didn't just buy something new. He didn't lecture me. He just said, sure, come get it, because that's how neighbors used to be before the boom years made everyone think they didn't need each other. Then I opened the phone book and started calling salvage yards, county by county. And I finally found one 3 counties over that had a diesel engine out of a 402 that had burned in a fire. The tractor was wrecked, but the engine was supposed to be good, and the man told me $1,200. $1,200. It was nearly everything I had sitting and checking. It was the kind of number that makes you swallow hard when you're used to paying cash. Because when you pay cash, you feel every dollar leave. You feel it like losing blood. But I also knew what a new tractor would cost on credit, and I knew what it would cost later, in worry, in payments, in the way your stomach tightens every time the market drops or the weather turns. So I told him I'd be there in the morning. I hardly slept, not because I was afraid of the work, but because I could already feel the clock ticking, the rain coming, the ground getting away from me. Before daylight, I drove my old grain truck out to that salvage yard, and it looked like a graveyard of ambition, rows and rows of machines stripped and rusting, pieces scattered like bones. And my engine sat on a pallet, greasy, heavy, ugly, and still somehow full of promise. And when I paid the man in cash and watched him load it with a forklift, I felt that strange mix of fear and relief, because now there was no turning back. No easy solution, no banker, no dealer, just me and a pile of iron. I hauled it home and backed the truck up to my shop, that little car garage building my grandfather built. Dirt floor packed hard, one bulb hanging from a rafter, and I rolled the chain hoist into place and stared at my 4020 sitting there like a wounded animal. And I knew what had to happen next. Splitting a tractor isn't a job you do with confidence, it's a job you do with respect. Because one slip, one bad block of wood, one jack that shifts, and the weight of it will crush you without asking. I spent that first day gathering what I needed: bottle jacks, oak blocking, pry bars, wrenches, masking tape, and a pencil to label lines. And when the sun got low, I loosened the first bolts, the ones that had been tight for years, and each one fought me like it didn't want to let go of the life it had known. Oil and dirt fell into my eyes. My knuckles scraped raw. I kept going anyway because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean hearing the voices of every man who said I was cheap and scared and behind. By the time the sun went down, I had the tractor split halfway, bottle jacks groaning, wood blocks stacked like a prayer, and I stood there in the dim light looking at that gap opening between front and rear, feeling my back ache and my hands throb and I told myself out loud, just once, quiet in that empty shop, "You're going to put this thing back together." I could hear the coffee shop talk starting. The same men who once laughed now ready to say I should have listened, and I hated that part most, not the work, not the risk, but the noise. So I kept my mouth shut and kept turning the wrench. I lost track of time somewhere around the second night, when the shop stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a test. The kind you don't study for, the kind that just shows up and asks what you're made of when nobody's watching. And by then the tractor was split wide open. Front half rolled away inch by inch on blocks and jacks, rear half sitting solid and heavy like it was judging me. And the smell in that little dirt floor shop was a mix of diesel, old oil, penetrating fluid, and sweat, my own mostly, because I worked from before the sun cleared the trees until long after it dropped behind the barn, eating sandwiches one-handed, standing up, wiping grease on my jeans, because there was no point pretending they were clean anymore. And every bolt fought me like it knew it was part of something bigger than me, like it didn't want to let go of the years it had held together. And I talked to that tractor more than I talked to any person those days, not because I was losing my mind, but because when you've spent half your life listening to a machine, you learn its language. The creak of metal under strain, the pitch of a chain hoist taking weight, the sound a wrench makes when a bolt is about to give or about to snap. And I labeled every line and wire with masking tape and pencil, because guessing later is how mistakes happen, and mistakes in a job like that don't just cost time, they cost fingers, backs, sometimes worse. The replacement engine sat on its pallet like a dare, greasy and scarred, smelling faintly of smoke from the fire that killed the tractor it came from. But when I checked the block again with a straight edge and my hands, it was sound, and sound was all I needed. I pulled the ruined engine out piece by piece, looking at the carnage inside like a man studying an accident report. A connecting rod twisted and broken, metal chewed where metal was never meant to touch, and I felt that familiar mix of anger and relief, anger that had happened when it did, relief that it hadn't happened on the road or with someone else hurt. I cleaned everything that could be cleaned, scraped gasket surfaces until my wrists burned, flushed passages, checked tolerances the old-fashioned way, because when you don't have new parts, you make sure the old ones are right, and I replaced what made sense while I was in there: clutch, pressure plate, throw-out bearing, because putting worn parts back together just to save a few dollars is the kind of false economy that comes back to bite you. And if I was going to do this, I was going to do it once. On the third day, the wind picked up and the shop door rattled on its hinges, and that was the day Roger drove by. I heard his pickup before I saw it, tires crunching on gravel, slowing down in a way that told me he was looking, and sure enough, he rolled past the open shop door and stopped, leaned out the window with that same half-smile he always wore when he thought he was proving a point, and he took it all in: the split tractor, the blocks, the chain hoist, the mess, and he shook his head and laughed, asked me if I was having a little trouble, said the dealer had a brand new 40-something on the lot with great financing, said he could have me back in the field by tomorrow if I wanted to stop pretending this was 1955. And I didn't answer him right away. I just kept tightening a bolt, because the truth was, if I opened my mouth then, tired and sore and covered in grease, I might have said something I couldn't take back. And instead I told him it was just maintenance, and he laughed harder, peeled out, sprayed gravel like punctuation at the end of a sentence, and drove off toward his lights and his big sheds and his future that looked so solid from the outside. And when the sound of his truck faded, I stood there a long moment listening to the hoist creak, and the shop settle back into its quiet, and I felt something settle in me too. Not anger exactly, but resolve. The kind that comes when you realize nobody is coming to help you, and that's exactly how you want it. The fourth day was the hardest, the day when nothing went right, when the replacement engine wouldn't line up the way it should, when the mounting bolts were off by just enough to make you question your measurements and your patience, and I had to use a porta-power and a sledgehammer to persuade steel that didn't want to be persuaded, tapping and checking, because forcing it wrong would mean paying later. And my hands were a mess by then, cuts taped over, knuckles swollen, Burns from the trouble light where I brushed it without thinking, and I caught myself wondering, just for a moment, what it would feel like to sit in a clean cab with air conditioning and an 8-track playing, to turn a key and let someone else worry about what was inside the block. And then I looked down at my hands and thought about what those hands could do, what they had already done, and the thought passed. That night I slept on the couch with my boots by the door, because it didn't make sense to track any more dirt through the house than I already had. And before dawn, I was back in the shop, bolting things together, reconnecting lines, filling fluids, checking everything twice, because you don't get a third chance on a job like that. And late on the 5th night, when the only light was that bare bulb and the moon coming in through the open door, I climbed up into the seat, my body aching in places I didn't know had names, and I turned the key. The starter ground slow at first, the engine turned once, twice, and then it caught, rough and loud and alive, and the sound filled that little shop like a promise kept. And I watched the oil pressure gauge like it was a heart monitor waiting for it to drop, to flicker, to tell me I'd missed something, but it held steady. And I eased the throttle up, listened, engaged the PTO, tested the hydraulics, and everything worked, not perfectly, not like new, but honestly. And I shut it down and sat there for a long minute with my hands on the wheel, breathing in the smell of warm metal and diesel, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, deeply. Tired and satisfied in a way that doesn't need witnesses. I finished planting the next day just as the rain started, fat drops darkening the dust, and I watched them soak in knowing I'd made it through something that would have broken me. If I'd handled it differently, the years that followed were loud years, the kind that make men think the rules have changed forever. Corn prices climbed. Soybeans followed. Land that had been steady for decades suddenly doubled, then tripled. And bankers who used to frown at every loan started showing up at kitchens with coffee and smiles, talking about equity and opportunity, telling men like Roger that they were visionaries, that the only mistake they could make was not going big enough. And Roger took it all in, fed on it, grew into it, bought more land, built bigger sheds, traded up again, international 4386s that looked like they could pull the world sideways, gleaming combines with heads, grain legs and bins that rose out of the ground like monuments. And at night his place glowed under mercury vapor lights like a small city, a beacon of everything modern and successful. And people talked about him with awe, with envy, with certainty, because certainty is contagious when times are good. And me, I kept doing what I'd always done. I farmed my 240 acres. I had some very good years, because good prices are good for everyone. But instead of chasing more ground, I fixed my own. I bought a better used disc, paid cash, poured a concrete floor in my shop so I didn't have to work in mud anymore, put a steel roof on the barn, and I bought a second tractor, an old International 856. Nothing fancy, but reliable, a backup so I'd never be stranded again. And I paid less for it than Roger paid in sales tax on one of his new machines. The rest of the money I put in the bank, not because I was clever, but because I didn't have a better idea. Certificates of deposit paying 5% at first, then 7, then 9, and men laughed at me for that too, said I was sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a garden patch, said Roger was going to own the county by the time he was 40, and I'd be left behind. And sometimes, standing at the edge of my field at night, listening to the roar of Roger's machines under those lights while my place sat quiet and dark, I wondered if they were right, if discipline had turned into fear somewhere along the way, if I was confusing caution with wisdom, because the noise of his success was loud and convincing, and my way was quiet enough to be mistaken for failure. But every morning I woke up without a knot in my stomach, without a payment due, without a banker's number in my pocket, and I kept working, because work was something I understood, and debt was not. By the end of the 70s, Roger was a legend, and I was a footnote. And if you'd asked anyone who was winning, they wouldn't have hesitated. But standing there years later, thinking back to those nights in the shop with grease in my hair, and a chain hoist creaking over my head, I understand now that those were the nights that mattered. The nights that built something nobody could see yet, not land or machines, but margin. The kind that keeps you alive when the noise finally stops. By the time the calendar rolled into 1980, the noise had started to change. Not enough that most people noticed at first, but enough that if you'd spent your life listening to weather and engines, you could feel it in your bones, the way a clear sky can smell wrong before a storm that's still 100 miles out. And that spring came in dry and stayed that way, week after week of blue that didn't break. The kind of blue that looks pretty from the road but turns mean when you're standing in a field watching corn struggle to decide whether it wants to live. And by June my crop should have been shoulder high and deep green, but it wasn't. It barely reached my waist, and the leaves curled inward during the heat of the day, like they were trying to protect what little moisture they had left. And the soil, that black Iowa loam everybody talks about like it's a guarantee, turned gray and powdery under my boots, puffing up with every step. And I worked it anyway because that's what you do, cultivating slow, careful, trying not to disturb. More than you had to, because when the ground is thirsty, you don't bully it, you negotiate with it. And my old 4020, rebuilt and honest, didn't complain. It chugged along steady, wide front tires kicking up dust, engine note familiar and calm, like it understood the job wasn't about speed anymore. Roger's place felt different. You could see it from the fence line, the scale of it, the size of the machines, everything built for a world where time was money and money was cheap. And one afternoon, I watched him cultivating with that massive International 4386, 12 rows wide, moving fast, too fast for ground that dry. The big tractor throwing up clouds of dirt that buried small corn plants in its wake. And I remember thinking he wasn't farming anymore. He was fighting, trying to beat the year into submission with horsepower, and the land doesn't respond well to that. Then one hot July day I noticed something else, something wrong. His big articulated tractor sitting dead still in the middle of a field, a quarter mile from the road, and it stayed there the next day, and the day after that. Dealer's service truck parked beside it, to mechanics crawling over it like ants on a carcass. And the talk at the co-op was that the turbocharger had failed, sent shrapnel through the engine, a catastrophic mess that couldn't be patched or nursed along, a $12,000 repair and a week down during a critical window. And I thought back to my own engine rebuild 2 years earlier, $1,200 and 5 days of my own sweat, and the difference between those numbers felt bigger than money. It felt like control. The drought finally broke in August, not gently, but with violent storms that flattened what was left standing. And the harvest that fall was a disappointment no matter how you cut it. Yields down across the county, bins filling slower than they should have, and for me it meant breaking even, not making much, but not losing either, because my costs were low and my expectations had been set by years like this. But for Roger, it was the first real crack in something that had always seemed solid, because his numbers were built on $3 corn and 200 bushel yields. And suddenly neither one of those things existed. And just when it felt like maybe we could catch our breath and chalk it up to a bad year, the second blow came from the radio, not the sky. President Carter announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Words spoken far away by men who would never stand in a field and feel what they'd just done. And the markets reacted the way markets always do when fear enters the room. Prices fell hard and fast, corn sliding from $3 to $2.50, then lower, and every penny mattered when you were leveraged to the hilt. That winter, something shifted in the coffee shop. The talk changed. The bragging quieted down. The stories about new equipment gave way to hushed conversations about bank visits, about operating notes, about what happens if prices don't come back. And I noticed Roger stopped coming in as much, and when he did, he didn't hold court anymore. He sat alone, drank his coffee, stared into it like it might tell him something he didn't already know. In early 1981, the letters started showing up, not just for him, but for everyone. Official envelopes from banks that used to send Christmas cards, talking about variable rates and adjustments, and a lot of men didn't understand what that meant. At first, because all the loans they'd ever known were fixed, predictable, safe enough as long as you kept planting. But this was different. This meant the ground under their payments could move without warning, and then the Federal Reserve kept tightening, interest rates climbing past 15%, then 18. Then numbers that didn't even seem real when you said them out loud. And the same CDs I'd bought, because I didn't know what else to do, suddenly started paying 10%. The interest checks enough to cover taxes and seed, enough that, for the first time in my life, my savings were earning more than my land. And I didn't feel smart about it. I felt uneasy, because every dollar I earned that way was a dollar someone else was paying. For Roger, those rates were brutal. His operating note jumped past 20%. Payments doubled, then doubled again, and no amount of optimism can outrun math. You could see it on him when you did run into him, the way his shoulders slumped, the way the confidence drained out of his voice, the way his eyes darted like he was constantly calculating something he couldn't solve. By the spring of 1982, auction signs started appearing along gravel roads, nailed to telephone poles, white paper flapping in the wind. Names printed on them I'd grown up with, men who'd followed the same advice Roger had, who'd believed the boom would last forever, and now their lifetimes of work were being reduced to dates and lot numbers. Roger fought longer than most. He sold a smaller tractor, then his new pickup. He tried to sell a parcel of land, but there were no buyers, not at the prices he needed, because land values were falling just as fast as they'd risen, and the 80 acres he'd paid $300,000 for wouldn't bring $100 now, and that was the cruelest part. The collateral that had lifted him up was now the anchor pulling him under. I ran into him one afternoon at the dealership, both of us there for parts, me for plowshares, him arguing with the service manager about a hydraulic pump bill he couldn't pay, his voice quiet and strained, nothing like the booming certainty he used to carry, and when he saw me there was a flash of something in his eyes, pride maybe, or anger, but it passed quick and left only exhaustion, and he walked out without his parts. And we both knew what that meant. That winter was the hardest I remember, not because of the cold or the snow, but because of the waiting, the way the county held its breath. And when spring came, the auction notices multiplied. And then one morning I opened the paper and saw it, Sterling Farms, complete dispersal, machinery, land, buildings, everything. Date set for March 1983, and I folded the paper and sat there a long time at the kitchen table, listening to the clock tick, thinking about how fast things can turn, about how right and wrong don't always announce themselves until it's too late, and about that summer day in 1976 when Roger laughed and told me I didn't get it, and I wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to stand on the other side of that line, when all the noise finally stopped and only the numbers were left. The day of the Sterling auction came in cold and gray, the kind of March day that makes you pull your collar up and wonder why winter is always reluctant to leave a place where so much depends on spring. And the wind cut across that yard like it had something to say about everything it was about to witness, because this wasn't just a sale. It was a reckoning, and everybody there knew it even if nobody said it out loud. The crowd bigger than any I'd ever seen for a farm auction. Farmers from 3 counties, bankers in dark coats, investors with hands that had never turned a wrench, all drawn to the same place for different reasons, and the mood wasn't excited, it was restrained, respectful in the way people get at funerals when they're standing close to a family they know. Could have been theirs. Roger's machinery was lined up neat and clean in front of that big Morton building he'd been so proud of, tractors and combines polished until they shone, plows and planters straight and orderly. But there was something sad about them now, like tools waiting for a job that would never come. And near the house I saw Roger standing with his wife and kids, his arm around her shoulders, his face set hard, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past the crowd, and for the first time since I'd known him he looked small, not in body but in presence, like the weight of what was happening had finally pressed him down to his real size. I stood off to the side, hands in my coat pockets, feeling the familiar weight of that certified check against my chest, and I wasn't there to gloat. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there because I'd promised myself years ago that, if the world ever turned this far upside down, and I was still standing, I'd remember why. The auctioneer started with the small stuff, shop tools, welders, vises, and I bought a few things I could use, paying cash, not because it mattered at that scale, but because it was habit by then. And as the sale moved on to the big iron I watched, Prices fall in a way that hurt to see. Tractors bringing pennies on the dollar compared to what Roger had paid. The bankers scribbling numbers on clipboards, faces tight, because every shortfall was still his problem, still his debt. And when they finally got to the land, the wind seemed to pick up, like even the weather knew this was the heart of it. They sold the homestead first, 160 acres with the house and buildings. And when a corporate outfit from Illinois bought it, I saw Roger's wife turn into his shoulder and cry, and he stood there patting her back, eyes wet but unblinking. And I looked away because there are things a man doesn't need to witness up close. Parcel by parcel the rest went. Prices slow, bidding thin, no bank money, no optimism left. And when they came to the last piece, the south quarter that bordered my farm, good flat black ground I'd watched Roger work for years, the auctioneer called for $500 an acre, and hands went up hesitantly. The number crept to $600, then $650, and stalled at $700. And I felt my heart start to beat a little harder, not from excitement, but from the weight of decision, because this wasn't just land, this was the end of a long argument. When the auctioneer called $700 once, $700 twice, I raised my hand and said $750, my voice steady, clearer than I expected. And a murmur ran through the crowd, heads turning, sideline Silas finally speaking up, and an investor in a camel hair coat bid $800. And I came back at $850 without hesitation, because I knew exactly what I could afford and exactly what I wouldn't lose sleep over. And when the auctioneer asked for more and the investor shook his head, the hammer came down, sold to Silas Blackwood, and the sound of it echoed in a way that felt heavier than wood on wood. I walked up to the clerk's table, legs feeling light, endorsed the check, handed it over, and just like that the land was mine, free and clear. No banker, no note, no variable rate waiting to change the rules, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet, the way you do when something you work toward without ever really admitting it finally arrives. As I walked back toward my truck, I passed Roger standing alone near some empty fuel barrels. His family already gone, and he looked at me, really looked at me, and I braced myself for anger or bitterness, but it wasn't there. There was only weariness, deep and honest. And he nodded and said, "You got the south quarter, good land, you'll do well with it." And I told him it was good land and that I was sorry for how it happened. And he gave a small broken smile and said, "Don't be, you were right and I was wrong. It's that simple." And then he looked down at his hands, clean for once, and back at mine, still stained from the plowshares I'd been working on that morning. And he said he'd listened to the men in suits and should have listened to the old men in overalls. And we stood there a moment while the auctioneer's voice carried on behind us, selling the last of his life. And when I asked him what he was going to do, he shrugged and said the bank would take the rest, bankruptcy, move to town, maybe work at the factory. And the fall in his voice told me how far that thought was from anything he'd ever imagined. And before I could stop myself, I heard my own voice say, "Roger, I'm going to need a hand on that new ground. My 40/20's good, but it's not getting any younger. And neither am I. The pay won't be great, but it's honest." And for a second, he just stared at me like he hadn't heard right. Then his throat worked, and he nodded and said he'd like that, and he meant it. Roger worked for me for the next 5 years, and it wasn't easy for him, trading a cab and a clipboard for riding the fender of an old deer, taking orders where he used to give them. But he worked hard and he learned again, and we never talked about the auction because we didn't need to. The lesson was there every day in the way the work got done. The farm crisis eased slowly, prices stabilized, land values crept back, and Roger eventually saved enough to rent a small place of his own, farming it with used equipment he paid for in cash, never borrowing another dime, and I kept farming. My 400 acres never got any bigger, bought a slightly newer tractor when the time was right, paid cash. Kept the old 4020 with its salvage yard heart for lighter work because it felt like an old friend. And my son David grew up beside me in that shop, learning how to listen to engines and land, learning the difference between a salesman's promise and something you can hold in your hands. And when he asked me once why we didn't have the biggest tractor on the road, I laid my hand on that faded green hood and told him this old iron is more than a machine. It's a lesson. It teaches you that what you own is worth more than what you owe, that your hands are your greatest asset, that the future people sell you is often just a mirage built on borrowed time. And sometimes in the quiet of a summer evening, I still stand at the edge of my field and look out over the rows that stretch across land that is truly mine. And I remember the bright, arrogant glow of Roger Sterling's farm all those years ago, how convincing it was, how loud, and how quickly it disappeared. And I know what I am. I'm not the king of the county, and I never was. But I survived, and in the end that turned out to be everything.